A few heads turned toward Dean. Still, he didn't react. Kirk raised his glass. "Let's be honest," he said. "Not everyone here is a real actor." The room tightened. This wasn't accidental anymore. Kirk glanced directly at Dean Martin, and then he said it, "Some of them are just hacks who got lucky." Silence hid in layers. 100 people. Every word heard. Every implication understood. Dean Martin called a hack. Publicly. Deliberately, someone coughed, someone else shifted uncomfortably. They waited. Everyone knew what should happen next. A joke back. An insult. A confrontation. An ego clash between two stars. Dean didn't move. Didn't smile. Didn't frown. Didn't speak. He simply folded his hands. That unsettled people more than anger ever could. Kirk, sensing momentum, pushed further. "I mean, really," he laughed, "some people mistake popularity for talent." Now it was uncomfortable. This wasn't playful anymore. This was humiliation. Dean finally looked up, not at Kirk. At the room. He scanned faces, producers, actors, donors, people who decided careers with quiet nods. Then he stood. Slowly. No drama. No raised voice, just calm movement. The room went silent without being asked. Dean walked forward, not toward Kirk, but toward the small piano placed near the stage, meant for background music later in the evening. He placed one hand on the piano, then he spoke softly. "Mind if I borrow this for a moment?" That was it. No insult. No defense. No explanation, just a question. People exchanged glances. Kirk smirked. "Go ahead," he said. "Entertain us." Dean nodded. He Saturday adjusted the bench, and without saying another word, he began to play. The first notes were simple, almost casual, but the room felt something shift immediately. The sound wasn't loud, it was controlled, intentional, confident. Dean sang, not to prove anything, not to impress, but with a depth that silenced every private conversation. His voice wasn't flashy. It was honest. By the second verse, nobody was smiling anymore. By the third, nobody was breathing normally. The room wasn't watching a comeback, they were witnessing command. Dean finished, let the final note fade. Then he stood, turned calmly, and looked at Kirk Douglas for the first time, and said only this: "Some of us don't need to explain what we do." He nodded once, and walked back to his seat. No applause followed, because nobody knew how to respond. Kirk Douglas didn't laugh. Didn't speak. Didn't lift his glass. He simply stood there silent, for the first time all night, and for the first time in that room. Power had quietly changed hands. For a few seconds after Dean Martin sat down, nobody moved. It wasn't awkward silence. It was recognition. People had just seen something they didn't expect. Not talent, not confidence, authority without aggression. Kirk Douglas was still standing, his smile hadn't returned. He lifted his glass halfway, then slowly set it back down. Someone near him whispered, "Kirk?" No response. Across the room, Dean didn't look back. He picked up a folded napkin, wiped his hands once, and leaned slightly toward an older producer beside him. "Nice evening," Dean said quietly. The producer nodded, stunned. That contrast between calm normalcy and shaken pride was impossible to ignore. Kirk finally cleared his throat. "Well," he said, forcing a laugh, "I guess we're all performers in our own way." Nobody laughed. A woman near the back looked down at her clutch. A director pretended to adjust his cufflinks. The energy Kirk had built earlier was gone. He had overplayed his hand, and everyone in that room knew it, because Hollywood didn't punish arrogance loudly. It punished it silently. The host of the event rushed forward, clapping too enthusiastically. "Wonderful, wonderful," he said. "What a treat. Truly." Dean nodded politely. Kirk stepped back, letting others fill the space between him and Dean, as if distance might repair what had just happened. It didn't. For the rest of the evening, something subtle but unmistakable occurred. People stopped gathering around Kirk, not abruptly, not obviously, just gradually. Meanwhile, Dean's table filled. Executives who hadn't spoken to him in months suddenly remembered him. Actors who once joked about him as just a singer leaned in respectfully. Dean didn't boast, didn't revisit the moment. He listened. That was the most dangerous part. Across the room, Kirk noticed. He noticed the shift, the lowered voices, the sideways glances. He noticed one of the studio heads, a man who once fast-tracked his projects, speaking warmly to Dean, laughing softly. Kirk's jaw tightened. Later that night, near the bar, Kirk cornered a producer. "What the hell was that?" Kirk asked. The producer didn't answer immediately. He took a sip, then said carefully, "That was Dean Martin reminding everyone who he is." Kirk scoffed. "By singing?" The producer met his eyes. "No," he said. By not needing to fight. That landed harder than any insult. Kirk turned away. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, because the truth, one he hated, was simple. Dean Martin didn't win the room by humiliating anyone. Kirk had done that himself. As the night wound down, Dean prepared to leave. He stood, put on his coat, and thanked the host quietly. On his way out, someone touched his arm. It was a young writer, nervous. "Respectful, Mr. Martin," he said, "I just wanted to say, thank you." Dean smiled gently. "For what?" "For showing us how to do it without bitterness." Dean nodded once. "That's the only way worth doing it," he said, and then he left. Outside, the cool Beverly Hills air felt clean. Dean paused near his car, looking up briefly at the night sky. No victory speech. No satisfaction grin, just a man at peace with himself. Inside the ballroom, Kirk Douglas watched through the glass doors as Dean drove away. He didn't wave. Didn't call out. He just stood there, shoulders tense, surrounded by people yet completely alone. Someone behind him said softly, "You shouldn't have pushed him." Kirk didn't respond, because deep down, he knew something worse than embarrassment had happened. He had misjudged the quiet man, and Hollywood never forgot moments like that, not because of gossip, but because of who stopped believing in you afterward. That night wasn't reported. No headlines. No scandal columns, but by Monday morning, phone calls shifted tone, meetings were postponed. Decisions were reconsidered. Nothing obvious, just enough, and Kirk Douglas began to realize something chilling. Dean Martin hadn't put him down. He had simply stepped aside and let the room decide, and the room had chosen. The studio lot looked the same as it always did, sunlight bouncing off white trailers. Crew members moving with practiced speed. Assistants clutching clipboards like shields, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. Dean Martin was scheduled to stop by that morning, not for a role. Not even for a meeting, just a courtesy visit. That alone told people everything. Dean didn't chase projects anymore. Projects circled him across the lot. Kirk Douglas stepped out of his trailer, sunglasses already on, jaw set tight. He had heard Dean was coming. No one told him directly. No one wanted to. That silence again, the kind that made powerful men uneasy. Kirk walked toward the main soundstage, nodding to crew members who suddenly seemed distant, respectful, yes, but not warm. One assistant glanced up, then quickly looked away. Kirk noticed. He noticed everything now. Inside stage 4, a scene was being rehearsed. Lights hung low. Cameras stood idle, and there, near the director's chair, stood Dean Martin, hands in his pockets. Laughing softly with two producers, not loud. Not commanding attention, just present. That presence carried weight. The director saw Kirk approach and stiffened slightly. "Morning, Kirk," he said. Kirk nodded once, eyes locked on Dean. Dean noticed him immediately. Of course he did, but he didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge him. That was worse than confrontation. Kirk cleared his throat. "Dean." Dean turned calmly, as if he'd just noticed a neighbor. "Kirk," he said pleasantly. The room went quiet, not dramatically, just naturally. Kirk forced a smile. "Didn't know you were visiting." Dean shrugged lightly. "Was nearby." Nearby. As if this wasn't one of the biggest studios in the country. As if his presence didn't tilt rooms. A producer laughed nervously. "We were just talking about that new picture overseas," he said, trying to break the tension. Dean nodded. "Good numbers," he said simply. No boasting. No flexing, just facts. Kirk watched the producers' faces light up at Dean's approval. That familiar heat rose in his chest. He stepped closer. "You know," Kirk said, voice casual but sharp, "I always thought singers had it easier. No real pressure." A few heads turned. Dean studied him for a moment, not coldly, curiously. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that didn't protect, didn't attack, just honest. "Pressure's pressure," Dean said. "Some of us just don't need an audience to feel it." That landed hard. The director coughed. Kirk laughed too loudly. "Guess we all cope our own way." Dean nodded. "Guess so." And then, here's what people remembered. Dean didn't stay. He excused himself, shook hands, wished everyone luck, and walked out of the soundstage like he had nothing left to prove. The room exhaled. Kirk stood frozen for a second too long. One of the producers leaned toward the director and whispered, "That man doesn't need scenes." Kirk heard it. Later that afternoon, Kirk was called into a meeting. Not unusual. What was unusual, Dean's name came up indirectly, casually. A studio executive flipped through papers. "We're rethinking the tone of upcoming projects," he said. "Public image matters more than ever." Kirk leaned back. "What's that supposed to mean?" The executive hesitated. "Let's just say, restraint plays better than force these days." Restraint, that word again. Kirk's fingers tightened. That night, alone in his trailer, Kirk replayed everything. The gala. The silence. The soundstage. Dean's calm of the realization crept in slowly, painful, undeniable. Dean Martin wasn't competing, he had already won by not needing to, and Kirk was still fighting ghosts, because the worst truth of all wasn't that Dean embarrassed him, it was that Dean never tried to. Hollywood had simply decided who carried dignity better. And once Hollywood decided, it didn't explain itself. It just moved on. The house was silent in the way only expensive houses could be, thick walls, muted light, the kind of quiet that magnified thoughts instead of calming them. Kirk Douglas stood near the window, one hand resting on the back of a leather chair. The city stretched below him, bright, confident, indifferent. He had hosted dozens of gatherings here, actors, producers, politicians. Tonight, there were no guests, just one. The knock came exactly on time, not early, not late. Kirk opened the door himself. Dean Martin stood there, dressed simply, no tuxedo, no spotlight uniform. Just a clean jacket, relaxed posture, and that unmistakable calm. "Hope I'm not intruding," Dean said. Kirk stepped aside. "No. Come in." They didn't shake hands, not out of hostility, out of understanding. They moved to the living room. Dean didn't sit until Kirk gestured. Even then, he chose the chair farthest from the center. That detail mattered. Kirk poured 2 drinks. Whiskey. Strong. He handed one to Dean. Dean took it, but didn't drink. Kirk noticed. Of course he did. "So," Kirk said finally, breaking the silence, "people think you humiliated me." Dean looked up slowly. "Did I?" Kirk scoffed. "You didn't deny it." Dean nodded. "I also didn't explain it." The room felt smaller. Kirk took a long sip. "You know," he said, voice tightening, "I worked for everything. Every role. Every ounce of respect." Dean listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't react. That silence again, but this time, it wasn't public. It was surgical. "I came from nothing," Kirk continued. "I fought my way in. No one handed me dignity." Dean finally spoke. "Neither did I." Kirk turned sharply. Dean met his eyes, steady, unblinking. "But some of us," Dean said quietly, "learned early that dignity isn't taken. It's carried." The words landed like weight, not force. Kirk laughed bitterly. "So what, I'm supposed to smile and let people walk over me?" Dean shook his head. "No. You're supposed to know when they can't." Kirk frowned. Dean set his glass down untouched. "At that gala," Dean continued, "you wanted the room." Kirk didn't deny it. "You already had it," Dean said. "You just didn't trust it." Silence stretched between them. This wasn't a duel. It was an autopsy. Kirk's shoulders sagged slightly, the first visible crack. "You think I'm afraid?" Kirk muttered. Dean didn't rush the answer. "Yes," he said simply. "But not of failure." Kirk waited, "of being irrelevant," Dean finished. The word hung heavy. Kirk looked away. Outside, a car passed. Laughter echoed faintly from somewhere down the hill. "Life moving on. I see how they look at you," Kirk said quietly. "They don't expect anything from you, and somehow that makes them listen more." Dean smiled faintly. "That's because expectations are louder than respect." Kirk exhaled for the first time that night. The fight left his voice. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Dean stood. "I didn't come to take anything," he said. "I came to make sure you didn't take something from yourself." Kirk looked up. Dean placed one hand on the back of the chair. "Not dominant, not distant. Hollywood remembers talent," Dean said. "But it studies behavior." Kirk swallowed. "They'll forget who spoke first," Dean continued. "But they won't forget who stayed composed." Dean picked up his glass, finally took a small sip, then set it down again. "You don't need to kneel," he said gently. "You just need to stop swinging." That was no threats. No triumph. Dean walked toward the door. Kirk followed him halfway. "At least tell me one thing," Kirk said. Dean turned. "Why didn't you destroy me when you had the chance?" Dean thought for a moment. "Because I didn't want to win," he said. "I wanted to leave the room intact." The door closed softly behind him. Kirk stood alone. For a long time of the next morning, something subtle changed. Kirk spoke less, unset, listened more, let moments pass without filling them. People noticed, but couldn't explain why it felt different. What they didn't know was this: the most powerful response Dean Martin ever gave wasn't delivered on a stage, it was delivered in private. And it forced a man who ruled rooms to finally sit with himself. Hollywood didn't explode after that night. There were no headlines, no interviews, No dramatic apologies. That was the strange part. Usually, when two giants clashed, the industry fed on it: gossip columns, whispered sides, forced statements. Of this time, nothing. But silence doesn't mean nothing happened. It means something settled. On sets across the city, people began to notice subtle shifts. Kirk Douglas was still Kirk Douglas, intense, driven, commanding. But something had changed in the way he occupied space. He arrived earlier, left later, spoke slower, and most noticeably, he stopped cutting people off. A young assistant director on a Paramount lot whispered to another one afternoon, "Have you noticed? He listens now." Listening was rare currency in Hollywood. Dean Martin, meanwhile, didn't change at all. That was the most unsettling part. Same relaxed walk, same soft humor, same refusal to dominate a room, but doors opened differently for him now. Executives leaned in when he spoke. Producers waited for his reaction before making decisions, not because he demanded it, because people trusted him. At a charity luncheon weeks later, a reporter tried to bait him. "Dean," the man asked casually, "any comment on what happened with Kirk Douglas recently?" Dean smiled politely. "I don't think anything happened," he said. The reporter blinked. "But people say." Dean raised a hand gently. "People say a lot of things," he replied. "Most of them aren't worth carrying." That quote never made the papers, but the reporters remembered it. So did everyone else. Behind the scenes, casting dynamics shifted. A producer once known for favoring Kirk quietly offered a role to Dean first, not out of rebellion, out of comfort. "He won't make this difficult," the producer told his partner. That sentence mattered more than any compliment. Kirk felt it too. Not as rejection, but as distance. He wasn't being pushed out, he was being stepped around. First, it irritated him, then it confused him, then slowly, it taught him something. During rehearsals, he caught himself pausing before reacting, choosing words, letting silence breathe, and every time he did, something unexpected happened. The room leaned toward him again, not in fear, in respect. One afternoon, months later, Kirk crossed paths with a young actor struggling through a scene old Kirk would have snapped. Instead, he waited. After the take, he walked over and said quietly, "Take a breath. The line will find you." The actor stared, stunned. "Thank you, sir." Kirk nodded and walked away, unsettled by his own restraint. That night, he poured a drink at home, then stopped, left it untouched. He thought of Dean, not with resentment, with clarity. The industry, too, adjusted its tone. People stopped speaking loudly about dominance, started speaking softly about longevity, about who aged well, about who left rooms better than they found them. Dean Martin's name came up often in those conversations, not as a warning. As a standard. At a private dinner in Malibu, a veteran producer raised a glass. "You know what separates stars from legends," he said. No one answered. "Stars want to be seen," he continued. "Legends want to be remembered." Someone murmured Dean's name. No one disagreed. Kirk heard about that dinner weeks later. He didn't ask who said it, he already knew. What few people ever learned was this: Kirk Douglas never spoke publicly about that night, never corrected the rumors, never defended himself, because deep down, he understood something crucial: defending your image often damages your character, and Dean Martin had taught him that without ever trying to teach. Years later, when asked in a rare interview about rivalry in Hollywood, Kirk paused longer than usual. "Some men win rooms," he said carefully. "Others change them." The interviewer leaned forward. "And which matters more?" Kirk looked away, just briefly. "The one that lasts when you're gone." He never said Dean's name. He didn't have to, because by then, the industry had already written its answer. Not an in memory. It was not announced. No press release. No invitation list passed around, just a private industry dinner, the kind where careers were quietly honored, not loudly celebrated. Old faces. Few cameras. Mostly memories. Dean Martin arrived late, not intentionally. That was just how he moved through life, unhurried, unforced, never racing time. He entered without an introduction. No one needed one. People noticed, of course. They always did, but what mattered was who noticed first. Kirk Douglas. He had been mid-conversation, animated, hands moving, the old fire still there, but tempered now. When he saw Dean, he stopped talking, not dramatically, it just paused. Dean nodded politely from across the room. No smile. No wave. Just acknowledgement. Kirk returned the nod. That was it. No tension. No reconciliation scene, because real respect doesn't require witnesses. Later that evening, as dessert plates were cleared, the host invited a few words from senior figures, and nothing formal, just reflections. One by one, men stood. They talked about films, about change, About youth and ego and mistakes. When Dean was invited to speak, he shook his head gently. I'm better listening, he said. Some laughed softly, but Kirk stood, not loudly, not theatrically. He didn't ask permission, he just spoke. I want to say something, Kirk began, voice steady. Not about movies. The room quieted. I spent most of my life believing that strength meant being louder than the next man. He paused, and one night, years ago, I learned I was wrong. No names, but everyone knew. There are men who fight to win rooms, he continued. And there are men who don't fight at all, and somehow still leave them changed. Silence. Dean kept his eyes on the table. Kirk turned slightly, not fully, in his direction. I learned that dignity doesn't need witnesses, Kirk said. And restraint can be the strongest move a man makes. No applause followed that mattered, because applause would have cheapened it. Kirk sat down. Dean didn't look up, but his jaw tightened, just slightly, the smallest acknowledgement after the dinner. People filtered out slowly outside, under warm California air. Dean stood alone near his car, lighting a cigarette. Footsteps approached. He didn't turn. Knew you'd be out here, Kirk said. Dean exhaled smoke. Too noisy inside, he replied. They stood side by side. Two legends.no photographers.no audience. Kirk spoke first. I owe you something, he said. Dean shrugged. I didn't give you anything. Kirk nodded. That's exactly it. Silence again, comfortable this time. I spent years thinking people remembered strength, Kirk added. But they remember how you make them feel. Dean finally looked at him. Then you're doing all right, he said. That was it.no handshake.no hug, just truth. Exchanged quietly. They went their separate ways, and they never spoke publicly about each other again. Years passed, Hollywood changed, faces faded, stories blurred, but that night, the one that started it all, never disappeared, not because it was loud, but because it was clean, because it showed something rare. A man humiliated publicly who chose not to humiliate back. Dean Martin never corrected the story, never claimed victory, never told his side, and that's why it survived, because the people who were there carried it forward, not as gossip. As a lesson that real power doesn't shout, that confidence doesn't need defense, that dignity, once seen, can never be unseen. Kirk Douglas went on to live a long life. So did Dean, but among those who knew them both, there was quiet agreement. One man conquered roles, the other conquered moments, and history remembered both, but it followed only one of them into silence, because when the room finally went quiet, Dean Martin was already gone, and everyone still felt it.